I'm very excited for today's program. We're going to be conducting a roundtable question and answer discussion about protecting LGBTQ and transgender rights, more specifically in 2022. Let me start off by introducing our guest today. With us is Avi Rudnick, Esquire and licensed clinical social worker, a lot of titles. Avi has been an attorney with the Transformative Justice Law Project of Illinois, TJLP, my goodness, since 2010, and was a coordinator with the name change mobilization from 2012 to 2021. Also with us is a good friend of mine, Elizabeth Ricks. Elizabeth is the legal director and staff attorney for the Trans Life Care Program at the Chicago House and Social Service Agency. The program exclusively serves transgender and gender expansive people and provides direct legal services in a variety of practice areas, engages in policy advocacy. In 2020, Elizabeth was named one of the National LGBT Bar Association's top 40 under 40 LGBT attorneys, and she is a fellow of the American Bar Foundation. Also many titles and awards. Elizabeth, welcome.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
So let's start off a little bit broad, because I don't want to assume that our audience knows all of these topics well. And I think there's a lot of misinformation and probably just general misunderstandings of what a lot of the terms that I just threw out there mean, and a lot of the terms we're going to use today. Sound good?
Sure.
Yeah.
So let's start off with this. What does it mean for, and I'm throwing this question out to the both of you or either of you. What does it mean if somebody identifies or says they identify as transgender or gender non-binary, or what does it mean for someone to be gender expansive? Who wants
to
take it? Avi, why don't you start?
Or if I want to take it.
I can take this, yeah. So somebody identifying as transgender or gender non-binary really means that the sex that somebody was assigned at birth, so you might hear people use the term AFAB or AMAB, assigned female at birth, assigned male at birth, does not identify with the gender or the sex that they were assigned with at birth. So that means, if somebody was assigned female at birth and then they, at some point in their life, and it could be at any age, people come out as young as 4 years old or 3 years old and as old as 80, if not older. But at some point in their life, come to the realization that they do not identify in the way that they were assigned. And so that means that somebody is going to potentially make decisions about how they want to live their life and how they want to be perceived by the world. And so for some people, that's a very binary experience where they will say, you know what, I was assigned female at birth, but I feel like I'm a man. In the way that, the socially constructed understanding of what a man is. But some people might say, you know what, none of these really fit for me. And I exist, maybe not even in between, but I just don't identify with either being a man or a woman. I feel like my gender is more fluid than that. And so that would really be somebody who would identify as non-binary, or as you read in my bio, gender expansive, this concept of, which is a term that's coined by youth. And I feel like I learned so much from young people about what's possible in the world. And so this idea that there's so many options when it comes to gender identity. And so I think that hopefully that answers the question. But I'll just add in that there's a lot of different ways that somebody can experience that, and a lot of different ways that somebody can transition. And that runs the gamut in terms of how much medical intervention somebody has, how much they choose to engage in, and what's going on for somebody on an individual level in terms of their own experience around gender.
So Avi, you just used a term that I'd like to dig into a little bit more. You said for them to transition. Mm-hmm. Again, I'll throw it to either Elizabeth or Avi here. What does it mean? Let's say hypothetically somebody is born female. They're born, their birth certificate says female, right? And at some point in life, 0 to whatever, they realize or determine that they don't fit in their body, right? Like the body they were born in, that gender does not necessarily fit how they see themselves and how they identify. What does it mean if somebody is transitioning from that point, from female to male, or in any respect? Again, to either of you.
I would say it's, as Avi said, it's so individual, and sometimes it isn't a matter of my body doesn't fit me. It's the label that was given to me that doesn't fit me.
Sure, and I'm sorry, I don't mean to speak glibly.
No, that's why we're having the conversation, right? So it's just any changes that work for that person so that their intrinsic sense of self can be more present in what they are authentically bringing to the world, and not having to conform to a letter that was put on a birth certificate. So that can be anything from changing how they style their hair, or changing their name, or engaging in medical changes, changing the letter on the birth certificate to something else. It's so individual. And I think something really to keep in mind, and something I see in employment cases a lot, is this idea that people, one, have to be on the binary. If they're trans, you have to either be hyper femme Barbie or hyper masculine Ken, even though with people who are not transgender, we see a variety of expressions of masculinity and femininity. But not to expect that someone who's trans or non-binary necessarily wants to change their name or wants to change parts of their body medically. Like it's very individual, but the transition is sort of coming into someone's own that isn't the box they were put in at birth by someone just arbitrarily when they're born, within the first 5 minutes of their life. Just get a letter stamped and there you go. It's expanding beyond that.
Well, to be fair, people are gendered even before they are born, and before that stamp is put on the birth certificate. If parents find out what type of genitalia their child might have when they're born, people are already being put into that box before they even are out in the world.
Fireworks.
Yes, right, with a gender reveal party that harms many in the process. Yeah.
Fair enough. So I guess maybe to circle back on that, transitioning, I think if I'm hearing it right, transitioning from what gender you were assigned at birth to wherever you fall on the spectrum can mean a lot of different things to a lot of people. It can involve some sort of a medical procedure, whether a surgery or hormonal treatment. It can involve name changes. It can just also mean how you refer to yourself. Am I simplifying that fairly?
Yes. And like I always joke and say I'm going to be transitioning for the rest of my life, because again, there are possibility models that I wasn't even aware of as a young person. So as somebody, I'm 45 years old, self-disclosure. But
you're still young, Avi. Don't sell yourself short.
Thank you. But when I was growing up, non-binary identity wasn't even a reality. Nobody talked about it. So I didn't even know that that was an option or a possibility for me. And so the more and more that I feel like we learn about the way that gender is socially constructed, the more possibilities become open. So transition is not necessarily always from a point A to a point B. Transition can be much broader than that.
One thing I'm curious about, and I think maybe there's some misconceptions about our pronouns. So something I was taught, I don't remember when, sometime in the last 7 or 8 years, is if you want to be inclusive on this topic, one of the things you can ask folks is, what are your pronouns, or do you have pronouns that you prefer? Can you talk about, again, throwing it to either of you, sorry, I'm not assigning questions specifically, but you both come at this from slightly different angles. What is the importance, or why do people ask for pronouns, and what does that mean necessarily when you ask somebody what their pronouns are?
So I'm going to jump in because I think this question often gets framed as pronouns for some reason are thought of as only something trans and gender expansive people have, but everyone who uses it, some people don't use pronouns and they use their name or they use something else. But for people who do use pronouns, it is not just something that trans and gender expansive people use. People who are not trans, who identify intrinsically with the sex assigned to them at birth, also use them. And so it's just a way to be respectful for people. And I use this example a lot, which is that in certain contexts, a man who is not transgender, if you used female pronouns for him, would be very upset because of the misogyny baked into our society. And yet we still have these conversations about, well, pronouns are just the pronoun people, just for trans people, just for non-binary people. Everyone has them, and it's just an easy way to like know how to be respectful for someone. And so I really encourage, I am a cisgender person and someone who was assigned female at birth. My intrinsic sense of who I am is also female. And I introduce myself in any space using my pronouns and asking what people's pronouns are. It's just another way to be respectful. Asking people's name, asking their pronouns. It's an easy way to know who someone is and how to make them feel good. And it shouldn't be relegated just to this idea of people who aren't cisgender. And it's sort of fascinating to me as a cisgender person that we talk about. Also that gender is only something that trans and gender expansive people have. But it's not, like Avi said, it's a spectrum, and every human is on this spectrum somewhere. I heard a trainer refer to it as a constellation, and I think that is the most beautiful way and like a really exciting way to think about it, that we're all part of this constellation. It's not, we should stop othering folks who aren't cisgender, because I'm very attached to my gender, and I don't think it's attached to my body parts. It's just who I am. And I think if my body parts were different, the Elizabethness of me would not change. And so I encourage people to think of it that way. Anyways, that's my little pronoun soapbox. I don't know, Avi, if you have things to add to that, but.
No, I think that that's very well said. And I think it's, there's a lot of different ways that we can affirm people's pronouns. We can do it by asking. We can do it by putting, your pronouns in your Zoom, next to your name and on Zoom. There's a lot of ways that we can normalize, the not making an assumption about what people's pronouns are. And in a lot of spaces, we even will do check-ins at every meeting because pronouns change, right? Like people might change their pronouns. Somebody might come out. Somebody might be making a different choice that day. So it really comes down to self-determination. I think that's what the whole aspect of pronouns and in respecting people's pronouns really comes down to, is self-determination and respecting people's self-determination.
I want to switch gears a little bit because unfortunately, gender identity and transgender folks have come under some fire lately. Not lately, but in increases nationwide. And I think it's important that we focus on that today. In the past year, a record number of anti-transgender expressly and specifically bills targeting transgender and gender non-binary folks have been filed in state governments, state legislatures across the country. There are unfortunately too many for the short time we have today to talk about in detail or even touch on. But let's start with Elizabeth. Can you give me a couple of examples of some of these bills that are working their way through various state legislatures, what they target? So in other words, what they do, what they're banning or requiring, and maybe dispelling some of the rumors or myths or just bad science that they are based on.
Sure. So there are a record number of anti-trans bills targeting youth that were filed in the last year. Some of the examples are bills in Texas. One in particular was targeting parents and physicians who provide gender-affirming care to transgender youth. So it would have revoked licenses from doctors who provide gender-affirming care to youth. And to be clear, that is usually hormone treatment that is easily stopped, and any impact is reversible. No one is doing genital surgeries on 14-year-olds because bodies, not because it would be wrong, but because bodies aren't done growing. That's just the facts. So it would revoke physician license for doing that. And then it would add to the legal definition of child abuse, parents who provide gender affirming care to their children. And the bill it didn't pass. So then the governor of Texas did sort of an executive order to override that not passing. And then it's in litigation currently. There's an injunction filed to stop it. Similar bills were filed in Missouri that didn't pass, but a bill that did pass is in our neighboring state of Indiana that would ban trans students from participating in sports, particularly, and the focus is on trans girls participating in girls' sports. And I guess there's two legal points that I want to point out, and then I'm going to pass it to the social worker to talk about the impact and some of these myths. But one is that this cannot be separated from what is happening in terms of reproductive justice. So the Dobbs decision, which removed the federal protection to abortion, is just, it's so deeply tied to this because this is all about personal healthcare decisions. Also, abortion care is not limited to cisgender people. Lots of trans people and non-binary people also seek abortion care. And so between the attacks on youth and the reversal of Roe v. Wade, we are in an emergency state for healthcare for trans people in the United States. With the sports cases, and Indiana is not the only state to try and ban young people from participating in sports, I think those will not survive litigation. But in the meantime, it depletes resources of organizations who now have to go and fight these bills. And it dissuades students from participating in sports, and it teaches lessons to other kids about, well, if the grown-ups are passing these laws, there must be some reason why trans girls can't play on sports teams. And so even if at the end of the day, the bills don't survive in litigation, the damage gets done. And it really does deplete resources and time from organizations that are working to defeat this, because there's just not that many of us in the United States. There's a growing number and doing great work, but there just aren't that many. But there are myths that are based on it, and the harm is significant, especially to young people. But I'm going to pass it to my colleague to talk on that.
Yeah, so thank you.
Talk about dispelling some of the myths about transgender youth and the harm that these bills do cause, even if they, I mean, as Elizabeth pointed out, they may be stricken down at some point, but for now, they still cause harm in the interim.
Yeah, so I can, I can wear my lawyer hat and my and my social worker hat and therapist hat here for a minute. So just to give some examples of direct impact that I've seen this type of legislation and, activity in the court system and the impact that it has, and in elections and the impact that elections also have. So one example I'll give is right after Trump was elected, and this was before, and, before there were like this many bills happening, and, before this was, front page news almost every day on Fox News about, like this fear factor of trans people. After Trump was elected at the name change mobilization, we had the highest number of people ever show up on a single day to the mobilization, to the point where we didn't know if we would have enough volunteers and enough capacity to assist everyone that day. It was something like over 40 people showed up that day to get their names changed in one day. And the vast majority of people were there out of fear, because they thought with Trump in office, they were going to lose all of their rights and they wouldn't be able to get their names changed anymore. And so regardless of like state law versus federal law versus this really wouldn't, impact you in that way, the sheer fear that was being experienced by folks had such a negative impact on people's mental health and their sense of urgency and their sense of feeling like they were being threatened on a national level. And so we're talking in 2016, right? And now, all these years later, we're actually seeing the impact of that train, so to speak, of moving. And I meet with young people, I meet with adults, and they all have this fear of what's going to happen. And that creates a real risk of harm for young people when we know how much higher the suicide rates are for LGBTQ youth, and specifically trans youth. The rates are so much higher than the general population. And so every time these bills come out, and every time people's rights are threatened in this way, or just the rhetoric, frankly, around trans people and around that, around what Elizabeth was describing with parents being accused of child abuse. The amount of trauma that has to be absorbed by these families and by these young people is extreme. And so this is a real public health crisis when it comes to the safety and the mental health stability of young people. And it's also teaching an entire generation of people to be violent against trans and other LGBTQ individuals, because all those kids who are growing up in households who are buying into this narrative of, trans people are literally going to, quote, destroy the union. I mean, there is somebody running in, I believe in South Carolina, who literally thinks that, and has been on the news saying that we should bring back the, the Committee on Un-American Activities, I think, from McCarthy era, because trans people are literally destroying the union, the republic. So like, there are literally people running on this platform. And so the impact is great in terms of people's mental health.
As I mentioned at the beginning, we could spend hours and hours covering these topics. Unfortunately, we're running a little short on time. So I do want to keep us moving. One area where there have been some positive changes in the last few years, for better, is after the U.S. Supreme Court's decision in 2020 in Bostock versus Clayton County. The Supreme Court held that under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, folks were protected from discrimination, in theory, on the basis of their sexual orientation or gender identity, because those were not sure things before that. Elizabeth, can you talk about some of the challenges you still see despite that decision coming out as it did?
Yes. I mean, as we all know, just because there's remedies doesn't mean the harm isn't going to be caused. But something that I'm increasingly seeing is I am seeing advancements in protections for binary trans people, less discrimination. It's still happening for sure, but lessened discrimination against binary trans people. But I see much heightened discrimination against non-binary employees, particularly those who use they, them, or other non-binary pronouns. And something I see employers engaging in a lot is, well, the opinion of their coworker is that that is not a real identity. And so I'm so sorry, but we're just, I'm sorry that their coworker misgenders them, but it's an opinion and it's taken very differently than any other kind of sex or gender discrimination. And I think this is the next big conversation we have to have in employment law, is that Title VII and in Illinois, the Illinois Human Rights Act, prohibit discrimination based on sex and gender is not binary. It prohibits discrimination against anyone based on their gender. And it needs to stop being, non-binary pronouns need to stop being seen as something that another person gets to choose who their coworker is. It's still discrimination. And I think that's the next big conversation and sort of movement we need to have in that space. And Bostock clearly prohibits that, but employers seem to be really coming up against a wall. Also a misunderstanding of laws generally, thinking that if someone has not had a legal name change, the name that they were given at birth has to be on every work document. And yes, it does have to be on your W-2, but it doesn't have to be on your name tag. Because we know lots of people who go by, John Paul, who might have Paul on his name tag, or JP, or, someone whose name is Richard who goes by Skip and it's on their name tag, or the receipt that prints out at their register. But for some reason, when it's trans person, and I think we all know what the reason is, just randomly some reason, employers really push back on that. And so people who represent employers need to be robust in educating their clients on in this space. But we also need to start thinking about gender discrimination beyond just, women should be allowed to wear pants at work, men can knit, these very binary ideas, and blow that up and say, it's also not okay for a coworker to decide their non-binary employee can't use the pronouns that's appropriate for them.
In our last minute or two, Elizabeth, I'm glad you mentioned the name change issue, because and to either of you in our last minute or two, there's a law in Illinois that may be coming up for a vote in the upcoming veto session at the end of the legislature. Can one of you mention what that name change bill is and why it matters and what folks can do to help with it? go.
Avi, you want to take it since I just
No, you can take this one.
Go for it.
Yeah.
Great. So the bill is House Bill 2542. We have the second most conservative name change law in the United States. And the biggest issues with our name change law are 3 criminal records restrictions. People with felonies cannot change their name until 10 years after the last date of their last sentence. People with identity theft convictions can never change their name in Illinois. We are only one of 2 states that has that prohibition. And then anyone who has to register on our 3 registries, depending on what your conviction is, either has a lifetime ban on name changes or a ban for the length of registration period. And even filing for a name change, if you are on a registry, is a felony. And so what we want to do is remove the 10-year waiting period, remove the identity theft ban, and then open the door for people who are on registries. So if you're changing your name for religion, marriage, survivors of human trafficking who frequently end up on sex offender registries, or gender-related transition, those folks would be able to at least go in front of a judge. State's attorney's office would be able to object and have a hearing on the totality of their circumstances and at least have a chance to change their name. For comparison's sake, there are only 20 states in the United States that even mention registries in their name change laws and have any kind of restriction. So clearly it is not a rampant link to harm if 30 states have nothing about it in their laws and there has not been any sort of causation there. So it passed out of the House, very strong bipartisan support. It has been in the Senate since spring of last year. Our next chance is next fall in veto session. We need people to call their senators and ask them to support House Bill 2542.
If folks want to get involved with organizations supporting transgender youth, just are interested in these topics, what are some organizations they can look to? And we'll run these at the end of the show.
Well, for trans young people specifically, I think there's a few organizations, and both in Chicago and out in the suburbs. And if I miss any, Elizabeth, please let me know. But one is we at TJLP, we do assist young people in getting names changed. So we've assisted folks as young as 5 years old with the consent of their parents, and as old as I think 79 is our oldest name change for trans folks. And then there's also other orgs in the area that provide support to young trans folks. So the Broadway Youth Center at Howard Brown provides support to young trans folks. Out in the suburbs, there's an organization called Youth Outlook that does a lot of work with young people and runs drop-in centers all throughout the suburbs. I think sometimes we forget that there's a lot of harm being done to young people out in the suburbs too, and a lot of isolation out there. And then, I think those are the main orgs. Am I missing something, Elizabeth? I think that's for young people specifically. Yeah, for over 18. There's a lot more.
Yeah.
And we'll run those in the credits and at the end of the show. I want to thank both Avi and Elizabeth for joining us today, for your hard work and important work representing folks and assisting them with these issues. Thank you to everybody at home for listening. Have a great rest of your week.